On a morning in early June of the year 1937, whispers moved more swiftly than the winds through the boulevards of Los Angeles. Jean Harlow, the young woman whose hair shimmered like pale fire under the glow of studio lamps, had departed from this world. Only 26 summers had passed over her, and yet her name was already engraved upon the consciousness of a restless age. The sudden silence left in her wake was unlike the silence of an empty room. It was a silence that hung like a veil over a place accustomed to noise and light, a silence that seemed to pause the rhythm of Hollywood itself. Before we begin this long wandering through her life and legacy, let me greet you, listener, wherever you may be. Perhaps you are listening in the quiet of the night, perhaps in the softness of an early morning, perhaps in the still hour when memory feels most alive. I invite you to share in the comments when and where you are hearing this story, so that together we weave a thread of remembrance across lands and oceans. And if you feel moved, I ask that you subscribe, so that this gathering of voices continues and this circle of timeless history grows with each telling. Now let us return to a time before the silver screen ever knew her name, before hair was turned to platinum light, before scandal and triumph became her inheritance. To speak of Jean Harlow is to speak of Harlan Harlow Carpenter, the child she once was. We begin, as all stories begin, with a family, with a place, and with the quiet pulse of early years. The year was 1911 and the month was March, when Harleen first opened her eyes in Kansas City, Missouri. The world into which she was born was far from the brilliant lamps of Hollywood. It was a world of brick houses, of the smell of coal drifting in from trains, of winters that left frost upon window panes. She was the cherished daughter of Jean Poe Carpenter and Montclair Carpenter, but it was her mother, known simply as Mother Jean, whose will and vision would leave the deepest mark upon her life. The girl would one day take her mother's name for her own stage name, as though her very identity were a reflection of maternal longing. The home was not without comfort, yet not without its shadows. Harleen's parents' marriage faltered, and divorce entered her childhood as an unwelcome intruder. In those years when the family was divided, the child became the focus of her mother's boundless ambitions. It is said that Mother Jean desired a stage career of her own, but never quite grasped it. And so she gazed upon her daughter with a mixture of love and expectation, shaping her not only as a child, but as the embodiment of an unrealized dream. How often, one wonders, does the course of a life begin not with the desires of the self, but with the longings of another? Was Jean's stardom born in her heart, or in the ambitions planted in her before she could yet resist? As Harleen grew, her beauty became unmistakable. Even in her youth, she was spoken of for the brightness of her eyes and the unusual radiance of her hair. But beauty in a small Midwestern town was more a curiosity than a destiny. It drew glances, yes, but it did not yet foretell the arc of her life. Childhood days passed with ordinary rhythms, school lessons, play, and the comfort of a mother's close presence. Yet, underneath the surface, her mother's gaze remained unblinking, like a lantern pointing toward a path unseen by the child herself. When Harleen was still young, she and her mother left behind the familiar brick and dust of Missouri. They moved to Chicago, and with that change came both new surroundings and renewed ambition. Chicago in the 1920s was a city humming with restless energy, with jazz spilling from clubs, with bootleggers carrying hidden flasks, with the sense that America itself was inventing a new rhythm after the tremors of the Great War. Here, Harleen was educated at a fine boarding school, and here she began to acquire not only refinement, but the delicate poise that would one day render her striking before a camera's eye. Still, even in these formative years, she did not yet dream of becoming an actress. That dream was her mother's shadow, trailing her like a second presence. What the girl longed for in those years was not fame, but affection. In her teens, she was drawn to love with a sincerity and intensity that marked her tender heart. At 16, scarcely more than a child, she fell into a youthful romance with Charles McGrew, the son of a wealthy businessman. He was older, more experienced, and his attention seemed to open before her the promise of independence, of escape from the constant shaping hand of her mother. Against the better judgment of age, she married him, leaving her school behind. It was an impulsive act, but perhaps also an act of defiance, a whisper that she might carve a path of her own, not one prescribed by another. How often does youthful love take the shape of rebellion rather than choice? How often do we mistake the warmth of escape for the permanence of happiness? The marriage, brief and fragile, soon faltered. The young bride found herself in Beverly Hills, in the orbit of the very world her mother had long desired for her. But she entered it not as a star, but as a young wife with little purpose beyond social circles. Her marriage with McGrew was not to endure, and within a few short years it dissolved into the ash of disappointment. Yet it was in these days, when she was still merely Harlan and not yet Jean Harlow, that she brushed against the threshold of Hollywood. Friends led her to casting offices. Casual visits led to small opportunities, and before long she stood as an extra upon sets where lamps burned hot and cameras whirred. It is easy to imagine her first day stepping onto a soundstage, the air thick with heat, the smell of makeup powder, the shifting shuffle of crew members moving props, the strange mix of chaos and order. She, a figure among dozens, hardly noticed, her face one among the nameless. Yet perhaps, even then, something within her stirred. For though she did not yet seek fame, there is a peculiar magnetism in the world of cinema, a lure that reaches even those who do not chase it. Was she already chosen, not by herself, nor by her mother, but by the indifferent fate of Hollywood that draws some forward and lets countless others fall back into obscurity? As the days of her youth slipped by, Harleen found herself pulled further into this world. What had begun as idle visits became small roles, background presences in films scarcely remembered now, but every flicker of the camera's lens upon her carried the weight of possibility. Even without words, even without recognition, there was a light in her presence that caught the eye. And though she herself had not yet resolved to walk this path, the path itself was already shaping beneath her feet. Thus, Part 1 closes in the shadow of beginnings, her mother's will, her father's absence, a childhood carried across states, a marriage too early chosen, and the first accidental steps into Hollywood. Nothing yet declared her a star. She was still a young woman in search of place, carrying both the burden of another's ambition and the spark of a fate not yet revealed. In the dim light of a soundstage, her figure lingers, unnoticed by most, yet carrying within her the seed of the platinum flame that would one day blaze too brightly to be sustained. And as the reel of her early life unwinds, we are left with an image unresolved. A young girl standing beneath the weight of stage lamps, her face half in shadow, half in light. What thoughts drifted through her mind in that moment of waiting? Did she sense the vast and tragic story already gathering around her? Or did she still believe she could walk away untouched? The sound of a studio gate clicking shut is a small thing, yet in memory it becomes large. The gate, heavy and iron-bound, swinging closed behind a young woman who had entered half in curiosity, half in chance, became for Jean both a threshold and a boundary. Each time she passed through it, she was reminded that there existed two worlds, the one outside, where ordinary lives unfolded with regular rhythms, and the one within, where make-believe shimmered into being under arcs of blinding light. For Harleen, who was not yet known as Jean, that gate was a reminder that she belonged to neither fully, caught instead between the echoes of her mother's ambitions and the uncertainty of her own desires. The move to California had carried with it a promise, though she did not fully name it. Beverly Hills in the late 1920s was not yet the vast city of glitter it would later become. It was still a place of quiet streets lined with palms, where mansions rose one by one upon the hillsides, their white walls glowing beneath the sun. At dusk, the air carried the mingled scents of orange blossoms and dust, and the voices of neighbors drifted through open windows. To walk those streets was to feel the proximity of wealth and aspiration, as though the very earth there pulsed with possibility. And it was into this atmosphere that she stepped as a young wife, still scarcely 17, her days without direction save the duties of a marriage that soon began to strain. Her husband, Charles McGrew, had means enough to provide comfort, but comfort is not the same as companionship. Their union, begun in haste, lacked the steady foundation to endure. They quarreled, drifted, reconciled, and quarreled again, until the silences between them grew wider than their words. And in those silences, Harleen began to wander, both outward into the city and inward into herself. She found companions among friends who were drawn to the film studios, who spoke of auditions and contracts, who wore their hopes like bright fabrics impossible to ignore. Though she did not yet name herself an actress, she followed them through the studio gates, a visitor more than a participant, yet one whose presence began to draw attention. It was in these early wanderings that fate, or chance, placed her before the eyes of men whose task it was to fill the screens with faces, casting directors, assistant producers, even the occasional director. These were men accustomed to seeing hundreds of hopefuls, most of whom passed through their gaze without leaving the faintest trace. Yet when they looked upon her, something lingered. She was still just another extra nameless on the call sheets, but there was a certain radiance in the curve of her smile, in the clarity of her gaze. Even in silence, she seemed to suggest a story waiting to be told. Was it beauty alone, or was there something deeper? A quality that could not be measured but only felt. That mystery became the beginning of her slow crossing from outsider to initiate. The roles she took in those first years were small, almost invisible. She might be seen at the edge of a crowd, her figure blurred by distance, or passing quickly through a scene where the camera lingered on others. Audiences would not have remembered her, for there was nothing yet to set her apart. And yet within the studio walls, whispers began. That girl with the pale hair, the striking features, perhaps she might be useful in something larger. Perhaps she was not merely another extra to be forgotten. One can imagine her, waiting in line with others. The chatter of voices around her, the scent of powder and grease paint in the air, as she heard her name called to step a little closer. Did her heart quicken? Did she wonder whether this was the path she was meant to take, or did she still consider it an amusement, a way to fill empty days? Meanwhile, her marriage unraveled. McGrew, weary of the Hollywood circles into which she drifted, grew resentful. Their quarrels grew sharper, their reconciliations fewer, until at last they parted. The divorce, while painful, left her unmoored but also strangely free. At 19, she was once more under her mother's watchful guidance, her life again entwined with the ambitions that had shaped her since childhood. Mother Jean urged her not to waste the opportunities at hand, to step boldly into the world that shimmered so near, and so Harleen, hesitant yet persuaded, allowed herself to be drawn further into the current of the studios. She began to imagine, perhaps for the first time, that her presence on screen might not be accidental after all. Hollywood in the late 20s was a place of shifting tides. Silent films, once the glory of the industry, were giving way to sound. The talkies, as they were called, demanded new faces, new voices, new personalities who could command attention, not only with gesture, but with words. Many stars of the silent era found themselves suddenly obsolete, their voices unsuited to the microphone, their styles outdated. In that moment of upheaval, doors opened for newcomers, for those whose freshness could meet the demands of a transformed medium. It was into this moment that Jean Harlow, though not yet fully Jean, stepped with cautious feet. It was not only her beauty that intrigued those around her. There was also a peculiar energy, a wit that revealed itself in conversation, a presence that seemed larger than her years. She could be playful, irreverent, and unexpectedly bold. Yet beneath these qualities there lingered a fragility, a sense of someone still uncertain of her place, still shadowed by the long reach of her mother's ambitions. The combination was captivating. It drew people in, left them curious, wanting more. Slowly she began to gather not only opportunities but also attention that would soon become both her gift and her burden. In these early days, when her name was scarcely known, she walked a fine line between anonymity and recognition. She could still walk the streets without being followed, still sit in cafes without whispers surrounding her, still return to quiet rooms where only her mother's voice reminded her of what might lie ahead. Yet each day on the studio lot, each small role accepted, each casual conversation with those in power drew her further from ordinary life. It was as though she stood at the threshold of a vast corridor, doors lined along its length, each waiting to be opened, each leading to destinies both bright and dark. Which would she choose, and which would be chosen for her? The gate that clicked shut behind her each time she entered became less a barrier and more a symbol of transition. Outside, the world of ordinary days continued. Inside, the world of invention grew louder, brighter, more consuming. And though she might have believed she could step back at any time, already the pull of that world was too strong. She belonged to it now, even if she did not yet fully know it. And so Part 2 closes with the sound of that gate once more, echoing faintly as dusk settles over the studio lot. She lingers there, half in shadow, half in the fading glow of California light, uncertain yet compelled, her figure already carrying the weight of what was to come. The gate shuts, but does it protect or imprison? Does it keep the world out, or does it keep her in? The answer, perhaps, was never clear even to her. The flicker of a film reel ending is a strange sound, both abrupt and lingering. It is the whirring of machinery winding down, the faint slap of loose film against the reel, the soft dimming of light as the final image fades from the screen. For Jean, who was still learning what it meant to exist within those frames, the ending of a reel was both a relief and an emptiness. Relief because she could return for a moment to the quiet of anonymity. Emptiness because with every reel's end came the unspoken question: would she be called back again, or would her image dissolve forever into the countless faces of forgotten extras? In those years, she often found herself drifting from one minor part to another. Sometimes it was the face of a party guest, briefly turned toward the camera as laughter filled the scene. Sometimes it was a passerby on a city street, her steps unnoticed, her voice unheard. For many, such work was only a day's wage, a way to remain near the studios without expectation of permanence. But for Jean, even these smallest roles carried a peculiar weight. Each appearance, however brief, left behind a faint trace of possibility, as though the camera itself had whispered that it had seen her, truly seen her, and might not forget. Did she sense in those moments that she was being prepared for something greater? Or did she still consider herself an outsider, playing a part that was never meant to last? The studios themselves were worlds unto their own, vast lots where artificial streets stood in rows, where grand staircases led to nowhere, where painted backdrops imitated skies and horizons. The air smelled of sawdust and paint, mixed with the powder of makeup and the faint acrid tang of lighting equipment. Voices echoed in every direction, directors barking commands, stagehands moving props, actors rehearsing lines. To wander through such a place was to feel both awe and disorientation, for nothing was quite real, yet everything shimmered with the illusion of reality. Jean, moving quietly through these spaces, carried herself with a natural grace that seemed to belong even amidst such artifice. Yet beneath her calm there lingered an uncertainty, a hesitation born of not quite knowing whether she was guest or chosen participant. Her days were long, filled with waiting more than with action. Hours might pass as she sat on wooden benches with other extras, listening to the distant noise of sets where her presence was not yet required. She read magazines, exchanged light conversations, watched others rehearse lines they hoped would lead to recognition. There must have been a peculiar monotony in those waiting hours, broken only by sudden calls to step forward, to walk into a scene, to turn her face toward a lens. And yet it was within those fragments that her destiny began to shape itself. Each waiting hour was a seed, each brief moment of exposure, another thread in the tapestry that was slowly weaving itself around her. Her mother remained close, guiding, urging, reminding her that she was meant for more. Mother Jean's ambitions had not waned with her daughter's uncertain steps. She pressed her forward, encouraged her to seize opportunities, to be seen, to be remembered. To some, such guidance might have felt burdensome, a constant shadow. But for Jean, whose natural indecision often left her drifting, her mother's will provided direction, even if it was not always her own. How much of her journey was chosen by her, and how much was shaped by the unseen hand of maternal longing? The question hovers like mist over these years, unresolved and perhaps unresolvable. Her beauty began to draw attention more frequently. Casting directors noted her pale hair, her luminous skin, her eyes that seemed to catch and reflect light. She was asked to return, to step closer to the camera, to smile, to hold her gaze a moment longer. These were small things, yet they hinted at something beyond accident. Slowly, her name, still Harlan, not yet Jean, began to circulate in low whispers among those who made decisions, not with certainty, not with the force of destiny declared, but with the tentative curiosity of those who sense potential waiting to be shaped. And yet, even as these first glimmers appeared, her own heart was uncertain. She did not hunger for fame with the ferocity that others displayed. She did not clamor for lines, did not push her way forward with loud determination. Instead, she drifted quietly, almost reluctantly, as though the current carried her without her full consent. It is a paradox often seen among those who become icons, that some who grasp desperately for recognition are never chosen, while others who move almost indifferently are lifted high by forces beyond their control. Perhaps it was precisely her reluctance, her lack of obvious striving that made her presence feel so natural, so uncontrived before the camera. Beyond the studio walls, her personal life was unsettled. The dissolution of her first marriage had left her adrift, and though she moved among circles of friends and acquaintances, there was always a sense of searching, of longing for something undefined. She attended gatherings where laughter spilled late into the night, where glasses clinked and music played, where the air was thick with both joy and desperation. In those rooms she was admired, sought after, courted. Yet behind her smile there was often a distance, as though part of her remained elsewhere, waiting for a purpose still out of reach. Did she already sense that the path before her would bring both adoration and sorrow? Or did she allow herself to be carried along, moment by moment, without yet imagining the weight of what was to come? As the film reels flickered and ended, as her face appeared in brief flashes upon the screens, her presence grew harder to ignore. Some audiences, though they did not know her name, remarked upon the striking girl who seemed to glow even in the background. Letters arrived at studios asking who she was, what her name might be. These were small ripples, yet ripples that hinted at larger waves ahead. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she was being drawn from the margins toward the center, from anonymity toward recognition. The reel that ended did not erase her image. Instead, it preserved it, carried it forward, whispered to those watching that there was something here worth noticing. And so we leave her at this moment, still on the edge of discovery, still uncertain, still half in shadow. The flicker of the film reel ends. The light dims. The sound fades. She remains seated quietly, waiting for the next call, the next chance to step into the frame. Around her, the machinery of Hollywood continues, indifferent to the fates of those it consumes. Yet somewhere within its vast turning gears, her destiny has begun to take form. She does not yet know it, but the world will soon know her name, and the burden of that knowing will shape the course of her short, luminous life. The reel has ended, but another is already being threaded into the projector. The faint rustle of celluloid fills the room, a sound both mechanical and mysterious. And with it comes the question, when the next reel begins, will her face once more appear, brighter, clearer, closer than before? The arc of a spotlight shifting into darkness is more than the movement of a lamp. It is the motion of attention itself, passing from one face to another, from one moment to the next. For Jean, the spotlight had so far brushed against her only in fleeting arcs, illuminating her for a second before sliding away again. Yet there came a time when it no longer shifted past but lingered, and in that lingering, her path was altered forever. The girl who had stood at the edge of scenes was now called to the center, and with that call came the beginning of her true recognition. The moment of discovery is often told in varying versions, as though even those who witnessed it could not quite agree on how it occurred. Some say it was on a studio lot, when a casting director noticed her among the crowd of extras and asked her to step forward. Others recall that it was at a social gathering, her beauty catching the eye of a producer who saw in her something worthy of more than silence. However it happened, the effect was the same. She was asked to return, not as background but as presence, not as accident but as intention. She was asked to speak lines, to embody a role, however small, and in the act of speaking, of standing before the camera, not as one of many but as singular, she was born anew. It is said that her voice, when first recorded, surprised those who expected delicacy to accompany her appearance. Instead, it was vibrant, warm, edged with a wit that sparkled through even the simplest lines. Here was not merely a beautiful face, but a character, a woman whose presence carried both charm and audacity. The industry, in its endless search for novelty, recognized in her a potential that could not be ignored. She was no longer just Harley & Carpenter, no longer only a daughter or a former wife. She was becoming someone else, someone fashioned for the screen. She was becoming Jean Harlow. Her first significant roles were not yet leading parts, but they were visible enough to draw attention. Audiences, encountering her for the first time, felt a sudden recognition that defied explanation. She had the rare quality of appearing both familiar and extraordinary, both accessible and untouchable. Men found themselves captivated by her allure. Women, though sometimes wary, were equally fascinated by her boldness, her willingness to speak lines with a sharpness uncommon for actresses of the time. She seemed to play women who were not content to wait, who laughed, who teased, who demanded, and in doing so, she unsettled expectations. For the archetype of the demure, passive starlet was still deeply entrenched in Hollywood. This first brush with fame was both exhilarating and bewildering, for Jean herself had not set out with a burning desire to be an actress. Unlike so many around her, she had not chased every audition, had not endured endless rejections, had not shaped her identity around the dream of stardom. Instead, fame had come to her almost unbidden, as though she were swept up in a tide she had not sought but could not resist. Did she feel wonder at this sudden turn, or did she feel apprehension at what it might demand? Perhaps both, woven together in ways she could not yet untangle. The studio system, vast and impersonal, had its ways of shaping those it chose. Contracts were signed, schedules drawn, appearances managed. Jean found herself drawn into this machinery, her days increasingly filled with rehearsals, fittings, camera tests. She was taught how to pose, how to walk, how to turn her head so that the light fell just so upon her features. She was guided in the art of gesture, in the timing of delivery, in the subtle mechanics that transformed natural presence into cinematic effect. And though she absorbed these lessons quickly, there remained within her an instinct, an authenticity that resisted complete shaping. It was this balance between artifice and natural vitality that gave her performances their unique quality. Her mother watched proudly, seeing in each new step the fulfillment of her long-held ambitions. Yet even Mother Jean, for all her determination, could not have foreseen the speed with which her daughter's star would rise. Hollywood, hungry for a new symbol, latched onto John with a fervor that seemed almost inevitable. Still, in these early days, the light was not yet blinding. There was still room for uncertainty, for hesitation, for the quiet moments when she questioned whether this path was truly her own. But the spotlight, once fixed, rarely shifts away willingly. It grows brighter, hotter, more demanding, until the one who stands within it can no longer imagine life without its glow. The atmosphere of Hollywood in those years was a mixture of glamour and unease. The industry was still adjusting to sound, still reinventing itself with each new success, still navigating scandals that threatened its carefully cultivated image. Stars were elevated overnight and forgotten just as quickly, their names etched in lights one season and erased the next. To enter this world was to step onto shifting ground, where stability was rare and trust fragile. For Jean, who had once known the quieter rhythms of Kansas City and Chicago, this new life must have felt both intoxicating and precarious, as though she were balancing upon a wire strung high above the ordinary world. The arc of the spotlight, which had once passed over her, now lingered with increasing intensity. She was no longer a passing image on a reel. She was becoming a figure whom audiences sought, whose presence could draw attention, whose name could sell tickets. With each new role, her image sharpened, her persona took shape. She was emerging step by step from the shadows into full illumination. Yet with that illumination came the first hints of the burdens it would bring. For to be seen so brightly is also to be scrutinized, to be judged, to be desired and criticized in equal measure. Already, whispers began about her beauty, about her boldness, about the possibility that she might be more than the screen could contain, and whispers, once begun, never quite cease. As this part of her story unfolds, we see her not yet at the height of fame, but at the threshold of it. The spotlight has shifted toward her, and though darkness still lingers at its edges, she is unmistakably within its glow. She stands upon a set, the cameras poised, the director watching intently, her lines ready to be spoken. Around her, crew members move, lights hum, voices murmur. Yet for a moment all is still, as if the entire machinery of Hollywood pauses to await her. She inhales, she speaks, she becomes, and in that act, the transformation begins. And when the scene ends, when the director calls cut, when the lights dim and the crew begins to disperse, she remains standing there, caught between exhilaration and uncertainty. The arc of the spotlight shifts once more into darkness, but now its glow lingers within her, a mark that will not fade. What does it mean to be chosen by light? What does it mean to step into a place from which there may be no return? The glimmer of metallic light on a still surface has the quality of both allure and coldness. It dazzles the eye, yet its brilliance is unnatural, a product of polish and artifice, rather than of warmth. So it was, with the transformation that soon came to define Jean. Her hair, once golden in a softer shade, was bleached to a startling whiteness, a tone so pale and shimmering that it seemed less like human hair and more like spun platinum. It was this act, simple in gesture, radical in effect, that crowned her with the title of Hollywood's first platinum blonde. From that moment forward, the girl who had been Harley Carpenter was no longer only Jean Harlow. She was a symbol, an embodiment of a new and daring ideal of beauty. The transformation was not entirely her own invention. The studios, ever eager to create and control images that would captivate the public, encouraged it. Hairdressers experimented with harsh bleaches and tonics, concoctions that burned the scalp and left behind a shine that could catch the light like metal. For Jean, the process was painful, the upkeep relentless. Yet the result was undeniable. Under the blazing lamps of the soundstage, her hair gleamed as though each strand carried its own illumination. It gave her a quality that set her apart from every other actress of her time, a look that was at once ethereal and provocative. She became the living embodiment of a fantasy, the woman whose very presence on screen was charged with electricity. Audiences were entranced. They had never before seen such a vision. A woman whose hair glowed like molten silver, whose skin appeared luminous against the dark shadows of black and white film. In a time when glamour itself was a form of escape, when the hardships of the Great Depression pressed heavily upon millions, Jean's image offered a kind of shimmering otherworldliness. She was not the girl next door, not the approachable beauty of familiarity. She was something else entirely, distant, untouchable, radiant in a way that belonged more to dream than to reality. And it was precisely this quality that made her irresistible. The effect on her roles was immediate. No longer cast as a mere background presence, she was given characters who embodied boldness, sensuality, daring. The films themselves seemed to bend around her presence, as though the stories existed merely to frame her brilliance. She spoke lines with a wit that was sharp and playful, delivered with a voice that seemed to mock convention. She laughed in ways that suggested both joy and defiance, as though she were fully aware of the power she held over those watching. And behind it all was the gleam of that platinum crown, a beacon that made her every movement impossible to ignore. Yet the creation of such an image carried within it a paradox. For though the world celebrated her as the platinum blonde bombshell, Jean herself remained in many ways the young woman who had stumbled almost accidentally into stardom. She accepted the image, played her roles, wore the hair as though it were armor, yet inside, she often felt the dissonance between who she was and what she was asked to be. Did she ever look into the mirror, at that glowing head of hair, and wonder where Harleen had gone? Did she feel, beneath the sheen, the loss of something softer, more authentic? The question lingers unanswered beneath every shimmering frame of her films. The studio, however, had no such doubts. They recognized in her a marketable phenomenon, and they exploited it with relentless precision. Posters were printed, taglines proclaimed her allure, films were built around her presence. She was labeled, packaged, presented as Hollywood's daring new goddess of sensuality. The press seized upon the image, filling columns with descriptions of her hair, her gowns, her laughter, her magnetism. Tabloids speculated endlessly about her personal life, linking her name with men both real and imagined. And through it all, she remained at the center of a storm of fascination, her every appearance magnified, her every gesture scrutinized. It is easy now, with distance, to see the cost of such an image. Beneath the gleam of platinum, beneath the laughter and wit, there was a young woman who longed for affection, for stability, for a sense of self not entirely defined by the demands of others. Yet the machinery of Hollywood left little space for such longings. She was a product now, a brand, a figure meant to embody desire itself. To resist was nearly impossible, and so she continued, step by step, film by film, to inhabit the role that had been fashioned for her, even as it slowly consumed her from within. Her audiences adored her, yet their adoration was tinged with misunderstanding. Many believed her to be identical to the women she portrayed on screen, brazen, sensual, mischievous, unashamed. Few saw the quieter Jean who laughed easily with friends, who cherished simple moments of companionship, who felt keenly the sting of loneliness. The distance between her image and her reality grew wider with each passing year, until she herself sometimes seemed uncertain which was more true. Was she the platinum goddess adored by millions, or was she still the girl who once sat quietly on a studio bench, waiting to be called? Perhaps she was both, and perhaps being both was the source of her greatest power and her deepest sorrow. As her fame grew, so too did the weight of expectation. She was asked to appear not only in films, but in endless promotional tours, interviews, photographs. Her days were filled with schedules that left little room for rest. Her nights, often consumed by appearances at parties and gatherings, meant to keep her name alive in the public imagination. The glare of the spotlight, once thrilling, became constant, leaving no refuge from its heat. And though she smiled, though she laughed, though she carried herself with the ease of one who seemed born to shine, there were moments when fatigue crept in, when the mask slipped, when the young woman beneath the platinum shimmered faintly through. The glimmer of metallic light on a still surface, so dazzling, so cold, remained her signature. It drew her upward into fame. It shaped her identity. It set her apart as a star of singular radiance. Yet it also carried within it the seeds of her tragedy, for no light can remain forever without consuming what lies beneath. And in the brilliance of her transformation, in the crown of platinum that the world adored, there already whispered the shadow of impermanence, the warning that such brilliance cannot last. We leave her here, in this moment of transformation, standing before mirrors as hairdressers apply their cruel potions, as the sting of bleach sears her scalp, as the silver-white strands emerge glowing beneath the lamps. She winces, perhaps. She smiles, perhaps. She submits to the process that has now bound her to an image greater than herself. Around her, bottles gleam under the lights, the metallic shimmer of liquid reflecting her own transformation. And in that reflection lies the question, is she becoming herself, or is she vanishing beneath the image she can never again escape? Applause fading into the hollow echo of silence is a sound unlike any other. In the moment, the clapping of hands is thunderous, almost overwhelming, a tide of human approval that lifts the performer higher than the self could ever rise. Yet when it ends, when the last hand falls still, when the theater grows quiet once more, there is left a void more profound than the noise that preceded it. For Jean, who now found herself at the center of Hollywood's adoration, applause was abundant. Every new film brought it. Every new premiere resounded with it. Yet when she stepped away from the lights, when she returned to quiet rooms, when the laughter and cheering dissolved into nothingness, the silence felt heavier than applause itself. Her ascent into stardom was swift, dazzling, and nearly absolute. With the image of the platinum blonde fixed firmly in the public imagination, Jean Harlow was no longer merely a rising actress. She had become a phenomenon. Audiences filled theaters to see her, not only for the stories being told, but for the presence she brought to them. She became Hollywood's first true sex symbol of the talking era, a woman whose roles challenged propriety, whose dialogue was filled with innuendo, whose laughter seemed to mock the seriousness of convention. She was daring, bold, unafraid to stand toe-to-toe with male co-stars in ways that unsettled traditional expectations. In films like Platinum Blonde and Red-Headed Woman, she played women who seized desire rather than waited for it. Women who spoke their minds with a sharpness and wit that was new to the screen. These characters were scandalous, yes, but they were also magnetic, and Jean embodied them so fully that the line between role and reality blurred in the eyes of the public. For the studios, her image was a treasure. They capitalized on it endlessly, promoting her as the ultimate embodiment of modern femininity. Posters declared her allure. Magazines published photographs that emphasized her hair, her smile, her figure. Reporters sought every detail of her personal life, every rumor of romance, every moment of scandal that could be attached to her name. She became a fixture of headlines, her fame extending beyond the screen into every corner of American life. Men admired her, women debated her, children recognized her face. She had become, in less than a handful of years, one of the most recognizable figures in the nation. Yet the applause, as intoxicating as it was, could not erase the contradictions that haunted her. For while the public celebrated her as a goddess of sensuality, Jean herself remained in many ways shy, even reserved. She laughed often, yes, but her laughter carried within it the trace of someone who sought comfort rather than dominance. She longed for affection, for companionship, for something steady to anchor her against the tides of fame. The characters she played were bold, calculating, brazen. The woman she was often yearned simply to be seen, not as an image but as a soul. And so the silence after applause became not merely quiet, but a reminder of the distance between who she was and who the world demanded her to be. The studios offered no respite. They worked her relentlessly, placing her in film after film, shaping her into a star whose presence could guarantee profit. She was cast opposite major actors, paired with leading men whose names still echo in film history. Her dialogue crackled with wit. Her expressions carried entire scenes. Her timing made audiences laugh and blush in equal measure. She delivered everything they asked of her and more. Yet the cost was exhaustion, both of body and of spirit. Long days under hot lamps, endless nights spent at events, a schedule that left little room for rest. These became her reality, and though she endured it with remarkable resilience, beneath the surface, her health began to feel the strain, though neither she nor those around her fully understood what was happening. The applause itself, though constant, was not always gentle, for with acclaim came criticism, and critics of the time often dismissed her as nothing more than a symbol, a body, a platinum caricature of femininity. They mocked her acting, underestimated her intelligence, assumed her wit was written rather than felt. They judged her not for her craft, but for her image, as though the brilliance of her presence somehow disqualified her from being taken seriously. And so Jean found herself caught in a paradox, adored by millions, dismissed by those who claimed to judge art. How must it have felt to be simultaneously elevated and diminished, worshipped and belittled, seen everywhere yet rarely seen truly? Her private life, too, was not free from the burdens of fame. The tabloids followed her with relentless curiosity, attaching her name to every rumored affair, every friendship, every fleeting gesture that could be turned into scandal. She was linked romantically to men of power, to fellow actors, to figures both prominent and obscure. Some rumors held truth, others none at all. Yet the constant speculation weighed heavily, for it reduced her to an object of gossip rather than a person of flesh and spirit. She smiled through it, laughed it off, played the game as she was expected to. But in the quiet of her own thoughts, did she not sometimes long for a life free from such intrusion, a life where love could be simple, private, genuine? And yet, for all these struggles, she remained radiant on screen. Her timing in comedies was impeccable, her presence in dramas compelling, her ability to shift from flirtation to sincerity in an instant remarkable. Audiences did not care what critics said. They knew what they felt when they watched her. She made them laugh in hard times. She offered them a beauty in years of struggle. She gave them a vision of a world brighter and freer than their own. And perhaps, in the end, that was a deeper form of artistry than critics ever acknowledged. For what is the purpose of cinema if not to lift the heart, to stir emotion, to create memories that linger long after the reel ends? Still, when the theater emptied, when the applause faded, when silence returned, Jean was left with herself. The echo of her laughter on screen was not the same as laughter in her own home. The warmth of lights was not the warmth of a loving embrace. The applause of strangers was not the companionship of someone who understood her heart. And so the hollow silence that followed each triumph grew louder, more insistent, more inescapable. It is a silence that follows many stars, a silence that no ovation can drown. Perhaps it was this silence, more than scandal or criticism, that became the truest shadow of her life. And so we leave her here, at the height of her fame, adored by millions, celebrated for her boldness, crowned as Hollywood's platinum blonde. The theaters resound with applause. The newspapers overflow with her name. The spotlight follows her every movement. Yet when the curtain falls, when the lights dim, when she returns to quiet rooms, there is only the hollow echo of silence waiting. She listens to it, perhaps with a smile, perhaps with a sigh, perhaps with a question she cannot answer. What is the cost of being adored by the world if in the end one remains alone in the silence? A script page torn and drifting away carries with it both fragility and finality. The ink upon it, words carefully chosen, becomes nothing more than fragments as it floats toward the floor, its meaning disrupted, its purpose undone. For Jean, whose life was increasingly bound to the words given to her by others, the script itself became both her instrument and her cage. Each role she was asked to play told the world who she was, or rather, who the studios wished her to be. Yet as those pages accumulated, as character after character appeared before audiences, the distinction between Jean the actress and Jean the woman began to blur, as though her true self were being torn and scattered like that drifting page. Her reputation on screen was fixed with startling speed. She became known as the woman who laughed at propriety, who used wit as both shield and weapon, who dared to speak with frankness that unsettled and thrilled audiences. In Red-Headed Woman, she embodied a character who pursued desire without apology, who used her beauty and intelligence to overturn the order of society. In Dinner at 8, she sparkled with comic timing, her presence so vivid that she transformed even small scenes into unforgettable moments. The roles were scandalous, daring, provocative, and they made her a star unlike any other. Yet in playing them so well, she also became trapped by them, for the public began to see not the actress performing, but the woman herself, assuming that Jean Harlow was as bold, as calculating, as brazen as the characters she portrayed. This misunderstanding haunted her deeply. For while she delighted in humor, while she could be mischievous and playful, she was not the ruthless seductress that her films suggested. Friends described her as warm, affectionate, quick to laugh, often self-deprecating, even shy in moments when she was not performing. She enjoyed simple pleasures, valued companionship, cherished kindness, yet the image of the bombshell, once fixed in the public imagination, left little room for these truths. Reporters wrote of her as though she were always on stage. Tabloids spoke of her life as though it were merely an extension of her roles. And so the torn script page drifting away becomes a fitting symbol for this part of her life. The words written for her characters tearing away from their fictional context and attaching themselves in error to her own identity. Critics, too, often failed to see the subtlety in her performances. Many dismissed her as a creation of hair dye and publicity, a product of scandal and allure rather than talent. They overlooked the precision of her timing, the intelligence in her line delivery, the ability she possessed to shift from comedy to pathos in the turn of a phrase. They underestimated her, and in underestimating her, they diminished her artistry. Yet audiences were not so blind. They loved her precisely because she made them laugh, because she embodied on screen a freedom they themselves could not claim, because she seemed to carry within her the spirit of defiance that the Depression years had pressed down upon them. And so the divide between critics and audiences grew, even as Jean continued to embody the roles assigned to her. The tension between image and reality weighed upon her in private moments. When she returned home after long days on set, after hours spent under lamps that turned her hair to silver fire, she sometimes spoke of wishing for roles that revealed a different side of her. She wanted to be seen not only as the provocateur, the seductress, the source of scandal, but also as a woman capable of depth, of vulnerability, of sincerity. She longed for dramatic parts that might allow her to show the fullness of her ability. And yet, time and again, the studios returned to the image they had created, the platinum blonde who made audiences laugh and gasp. The torn page drifting away was not only her characters escaping into her identity, but also her own longing for roles denied, carried away by the winds of commerce. Her co-stars recognized her talent more than critics did. Clark Gable, with whom she was paired in several films, spoke of her timing, her instinct, her ability to hold her own against him in scenes where many actresses would have been overshadowed. William Powell admired her wit and intelligence, appreciating the warmth she brought to their time together. Directors noted her professionalism, her ability to arrive prepared, her resilience despite the exhaustion that the relentless pace of filming imposed. Within the industry, among those who truly knew her, she was respected and beloved. But the public saw only the surface, the platinum gleam, the scandalous characters, the laughter that seemed to mock propriety. It is a strange fate, to be loved so deeply, yet known so poorly. Meanwhile, the toll of fame grew heavier. Her name was constantly in the headlines, often surrounded by speculation and gossip. Every friendship was turned into a supposed romance, every gesture analyzed for hidden meaning, every smile interpreted as evidence of scandal. The boundary between her life and her image dissolved almost completely. She played daring women on screen, and so the world insisted she must live daringly off-screen as well. The real Jean, the young woman who cherished her mother's presence, who sought affection and companionship, who sometimes longed simply for peace, was lost beneath the weight of public imagination. How often, one wonders, did she feel herself becoming invisible beneath the glare of her own fame? And yet, for all this, she continued to give herself to her roles with unflagging energy. She laughed, she sparkled, she commanded the screen. She accepted the parts given to her, even when they confined her, because she understood that her audience loved her in them. And perhaps, beneath her frustration, there was also pride. Pride in knowing that she had brought joy to millions. Pride in knowing that she had become a symbol of daring. Pride in knowing that her presence had left a mark upon cinema that would not soon fade. Even as the torn script page drifted away, scattering identity and image, she continued to write herself into history with every performance. We leave her here, in a moment when her fame is unquestioned, when her roles have made her both adored and misunderstood, when the applause resounds even as silence presses in behind it. A page drifts to the floor, torn from its binding, words incomplete, meaning lost. Around her, new scripts are waiting, filled with characters she will bring to life, characters who will further blur the boundary between fiction and reality. And as she picks up the torn page, perhaps with a wistful smile, one cannot help but wonder which lines upon it belong to the character and which belong to Jean herself. The rustle of newspapers tossed aside is not a single sound, but a chorus of small cracklings, like dry leaves shifting in the wind. For Jean, that sound became the backdrop of her existence, for her life was lived upon the fragile paper of gossip columns and studio announcements. Each day brought new headlines, each week new speculation. Reporters, hungry for scandal, fed upon her name as though it were an endless source of nourishment, and the public devoured every story, true or false. The rustle of newspapers was thus not the passing of news, but the daily judgment of a society that craved both glamour and downfall in equal measure. The tabloid press of the early 1930s was relentless, shaped by an age when Hollywood had become the grand escape from economic despair. Millions endured the hardship of the Depression, and yet for a few coins they could sit in darkened theaters and watch Jean Harlow laugh, seduce, or defy convention. When the reels ended, they sought more. Stories that brought the illusion of Hollywood into the reality of their kitchens and workplaces. And so the newspapers obliged, filling their pages with rumors of Jean's affairs, accounts of her supposed extravagances, whispers of her every movement. Truth mattered less than intrigue, and scandal mattered more than truth. Some stories were born from shadows of reality, Jean's friendships with co-stars, her nights spent at parties, her visible companionship with men both famous and obscure. All of these became fodder for headlines. A smile caught by a photographer became evidence of romance, a moment of laughter, proof of an affair. Other stories were pure invention, fantasies spun from the minds of journalists who knew that her name alone sold papers. And though Jean laughed at many of these tales, though she learned to play the game of dismissing rumor with humor, the constant scrutiny wore upon her. To wake each morning and see oneself described in ways unrecognizable is to feel both exposure and erasure at once. Exposure of one's image, erasure of one's truth. Her mother, fiercely protective, tried to shield her, yet even she could not prevent the flood. Hollywood itself thrived upon such stories, for scandal kept stars in the public eye, and visibility was the currency of fame. Studios alternated between defending Jean and quietly feeding stories to the press, calculating always which narrative would most benefit the next release. In this way, Jean became both beneficiary and victim of a system that thrived upon her image while eroding her privacy. The rustle of newspapers was thus the sound of her success and the whisper of her vulnerability. The public, however, was insatiable in its fascination. They adored not only the characters she played, but also the myth of her life. To them, she was not simply an actress, but a living symbol of boldness and sensuality. And they longed to believe that the woman who seduced men on screen did the same off it, that her laughter was as mischievous in private as in her films, that her romances were as daring as her characters. In Jean Harlow, they found a figure who embodied a fantasy of freedom and audacity, and so they refused to accept any version of her that contradicted it. When she sought moments of quiet, they were ignored. When she expressed her desire for simple companionship, those words vanished beneath the louder noise of scandal. The strain of such constant attention deepened. Jean, who wished to be taken seriously as an actress, found herself instead taken primarily as a figure of gossip. Critics dismissed her, audiences adored her, but the newspapers defined her. She walked through the streets of Los Angeles and felt eyes upon her, whispering, measuring her against the headlines they had read. At times she embraced it, laughing, playing into the image for the sake of charm. At other times she felt trapped, unable to step beyond the caricature that had been drawn of her. Fame, she discovered, was not merely light, but also shadow, not merely applause, but also noise. Yet she bore it with remarkable resilience. Rather than retreat, she continued to deliver performances of vitality and wit. She sharpened her comedic timing, leaned into the humor of her roles, found ways to transform the very image that trapped her into a source of strength. If the world insisted upon seeing her as bold and scandalous, she gave them boldness with artistry, scandal with humor. She mocked convention not only in character but in performance itself, turning her roles into acts of defiance against the constraints of society. And in doing so, she won the love of audiences who recognized in her a spirit of rebellion they themselves longed to express. Still, the toll was undeniable. Each new scandal reported in the papers was another layer of distance between Jean and her own truth. Each story twisted her life into fiction until fiction and reality were indistinguishable. Did she ever sit alone, rustling through the pages herself, and wonder who this woman was? This Jean Harlow whom the papers described. Did she feel herself vanishing beneath the weight of invention, her real laughter drowned out by the echo of her own image repeated endlessly across columns? The silence after applause was heavy, but the noise of rumor was equally suffocating. Between them, where could she find herself? And yet, in the midst of it, she carried on with remarkable grace. Friends who knew her well spoke of her warmth, her generosity, her ability to bring laughter even in private moments. They described a woman who loved simple pleasures, who enjoyed the company of those she trusted, who could be tender even when the world demanded she be dazzling. This Jean, hidden from the public eye, was the one who longed for love not as spectacle, but as sanctuary. But the rustle of newspapers, tossed aside each morning, ensured that the world would never see her fully, that her reality would always be filtered through the lens of scandal. We leave her here, surrounded by the noise of printed words, her name scattered across headlines, her life reduced to fragments of rumor. The papers rustle, tossed aside by those who have consumed their stories, forgotten by evening though devoured in morning. And amid that rustling, Jean sits quietly, perhaps smiling, perhaps sighing, perhaps wondering which version of herself will be written tomorrow. The sound of paper fades into the distance, leaving only the question, how long can one live beneath the weight of so many stories, not one's own? A wedding ring glinting on an empty table is a sight of contradiction. It speaks of vows once spoken, of promises once cherished, and yet its solitude betrays the absence of the hand that once wore it. For Jean, marriage entered her life not as a sanctuary, but as a series of experiments in companionship, each one luminous in its beginning and fractured in its end. The ring, bright and cold, reflected her desire for belonging while casting shadows of disappointment across her heart. In the gaze of the public, her marriages became spectacle. In her own private thoughts, they were tender attempts at connection that so often dissolved into loneliness. Her first marriage, still scarcely more than a child's rebellion, had already faded by the time her fame began to bloom. That union with Charles McGrew was short-lived and shaped more by youthful impulse than by deep understanding. Its dissolution left her with freedom, but also with a trace of weariness, an early recognition that marriage did not always fulfill the promises of love it carried. Yet she did not give up hope. For Jean was a woman who longed for companionship as much as she longed for success. Her laughter was brightest when shared, her heart most open when in the presence of affection. And so, in time, another ring found its way to her finger, another vow spoken beneath the gaze of both family and industry. The second marriage was to Paul Bern, a man of the film world, a producer at MGM who saw in her not only beauty but potential. To him, she was more than the platinum goddess adored by audiences. He recognized her intelligence, her wit, her capacity for growth as an actress. Their union, brief as it was, carried within it the promise of stability, the suggestion that perhaps Jean had found a partner who could stand beside her not only in the glare of lights but also in the quiet of evenings. Yet even here, shadows gathered. For Bern was a man with complexities of his own, burdens and sorrows that he carried into their marriage. The glint of the wedding ring upon the table was bright, but the silence between them was heavy. The tragedy of Paul Bern's death remains one of the most haunting chapters in Jean's story. Only months into their marriage, he was found dead in their home, a gunshot ending his life. The newspapers, already so eager to devour her name, erupted with speculation. Rumors of scandal, whispers of secret pasts, tales of shame and despair, these filled the columns, turning her personal grief into public spectacle. Jean, still in the bloom of youth, still unprepared for such darkness, was thrust into a storm of accusation and pity. Was she victim or accomplice, grieving widow or femme fatale? The papers could not decide, and so they wrote her as all of them, leaving her to navigate a grief that was both genuine and distorted beyond recognition. For Jean herself, the loss was profound. She had loved Paul in her way, cherished his companionship, found in him a measure of understanding, rare among those who surrounded her. His sudden death tore from her not only a husband, but also the fragile hope of stability she had begun to build. She wept. She withdrew. She sought comfort where little could be found. And yet, as always, the machinery of Hollywood allowed her little time to grieve. The studio shielded her as best it could, deflecting some accusations, controlling the narrative, ensuring that her career continued. But the pain within her was not so easily controlled. The glint of the wedding ring, now unworn, remained a reminder of promises undone, of love lost to shadows deeper than she could fathom. In time, she sought companionship again, for her heart was not one to remain closed. She entered into another marriage, this one with cinematographer Harold Rawson, though it too was short-lived. Like the others, it began with warmth and promise, but faltered under the strain of fame, of intrusion, of incompatible lives. Each ring she wore seemed to carry the weight not only of hope, but also of impermanence. Each vow spoken was soon overshadowed by silence. The glimmer of metal upon her finger was bright, yet always it seemed to end up glinting alone upon a table, abandoned, unresolved. For the public, these marriages were scandals, stories to be devoured in morning papers, whispers to be exchanged in theaters before the reels began. For Jean, they were tender attempts to find what all hearts long for, the comfort of being truly known, the steadiness of belonging to another. Yet again and again, the glare of her fame intruded, the noise of rumor distorted. The demands of her work intruded upon private joys, and so she remained in many ways profoundly alone, surrounded by love in fragments, but never able to hold it whole. The image of a wedding ring upon an empty table thus becomes more than a symbol of her marriages. It is a symbol of the paradox of her life. She was adored by millions, yet struggled to find a single love that endured. She wore jewels and gowns, yet longed for simple companionship. She was surrounded always by light and sound, yet so often left to face silence in her most private hours. The ring glimmered, yes, but the hand that reached for it trembled with both hope and sorrow. And so we leave her in this moment, standing at the threshold of middle fame, her heart marked by both adoration and grief. A ring lies upon the table, glinting in the dim light of evening untouched. She looks at it, perhaps with longing, perhaps with resignation, perhaps with the quiet strength of one who has already endured more than her years would suggest. The newspapers will soon rustle again, filled with stories of scandal and speculation. But here, In this quiet room, there is only the gleam of metal and the silence of absence. What, then, is love to a woman whom the world insists upon loving, yet refuses to let love freely? The echo of a gunshot muffled by walls is a sound that lingers even when silence follows. It is not the sharp crack of violence alone, but the way it reverberates through space, clinging to corners, seeping into memory. For Jean, that muffled echo became a presence she could never escape. It marked the moment when her second marriage, to Paul Bern, ended not in quarrel or gradual fading, but in sudden tragedy. A young bride, a star rising, she awoke one morning to find her life irreversibly altered by the sound that had already died away, leaving only questions and whispers behind. Paul Bern was no ordinary man. He was a producer at MGM, respected, thoughtful, older than Jean by many years. Where she carried the light of youth and allure, he carried the gravity of experience. Their union had seemed, to those who observed it, improbable, yet promising. Bern admired not only her beauty, but her intelligence, her sharp humor, her capacity for growth as an actress. He believed in her potential, spoke to her not as a commodity, but as a person, encouraged her to seek more than the shallow roles she was so often given. For Jean, weary of being seen only as the platinum goddess, his recognition was a balm, a suggestion that perhaps she could be more. Their wedding had been quiet, a gesture of intimacy rather than spectacle, and for a brief moment it seemed she had found companionship that was steady, perhaps even lasting. But the silence of their home was soon shattered. One night in 1932, Bern returned to their residence in Beverly Hills. What followed remains shrouded in mystery, but the next morning he was discovered dead, a bullet wound ending his life. The note he left behind was ambiguous, its words subject to interpretation, its meaning contested by both studio officials and the press. Some claimed it was a farewell, a confession of despair. Others insisted it was a private attempt to shield Jean from shame, for rumors swirled of Bern's troubled past, of secrets he carried, of burdens too heavy to name. Whatever the truth, the fact remained, Jean, at only 21 years old, was left a widow, her life entangled in a tragedy that the world seized upon with ravenous curiosity. The newspapers erupted. Headlines screamed of scandal, of mystery, of whispers too dark to print fully. Some claimed Bern had taken his life out of despair at being unable to satisfy a young and radiant wife. Others alleged sordid secrets, mistresses from his past, debts of shame, affairs unspoken. Jean's name was woven into every account, her grief dissected, her innocence questioned, her beauty turned into accusation. Was she the cause of his despair? Was she victim or temptress, widow or accomplice? The tabloids could not decide, and so they painted her in every shade at once, leaving her both defended and condemned, both pitied and vilified. For Jean herself, the shock was overwhelming. She loved Bern, not with the wildness of youthful passion perhaps, but with the tender gratitude of a woman who felt understood. His loss cut deeply, not only because he was gone, but because his death became spectacle. She could not grieve in silence, for her mourning was intruded upon by flashing cameras, by journalists at her gate, by strangers speculating upon her pain. She wept, yes, but she also endured. With remarkable poise, she faced the public, answered questions with grace, allowed the machinery of MGM to shield her as best it could. The studio declared the tragedy private, insisted she bore no blame, and moved quickly to protect their valuable star. Yet no shield could truly protect her from the echo of that gunshot, muffled but unending within her memory. The marriage to Paul Bern, brief though it was, became one of the defining events of her life, for it revealed, more starkly than ever before, the chasm between her private self and her public image. To Jean, Bern had been a source of quiet encouragement, a man who spoke to her with respect. To the world, his death became yet another chapter in the scandalous saga of Jean Harlow, the platinum blonde bombshell whose life seemed inseparable from rumor. The torn script pages of her earlier roles now seemed prophetic, as though the character she played had stepped from the screen into her own life, blurring the boundary between fiction and reality. She was seen not as a grieving widow, but as a character in a sordid tale, her pain reduced to entertainment. In the months that followed, Jean sought to return to her work, for work was both refuge and demand. MGM placed her in new films, eager to shift the public's attention from scandal back to glamour. And she, resilient as ever, delivered performances that sparkled with humor, that shimmered with the vitality audiences adored. She laughed on screen even as she mourned in private. She embodied daring characters, even as her own heart was heavy. She gave herself to her craft, and in doing so, she survived. Yet beneath it all, the echo of the gunshot remained, muffled but present, a reminder of loss and of the fragility of love in a life lived beneath unyielding light. Her colleagues admired her strength. Clark Gable spoke of her professionalism, her ability to arrive on set ready to work, despite the storm surrounding her. Friends noted her humor, her refusal to succumb entirely to sorrow, her insistence on finding laughter even in grief. And yet they also saw, in quiet moments, the shadow that lingered in her eyes, the trace of sadness that no performance could erase. Jean carried her grief not as spectacle but as a private wound, even as the world refused to let it remain private. The echo of the gunshot muffled by walls thus became more than a sound. It became a presence, an invisible companion that walked beside her through the years that followed. It shaped her understanding of love, deepened her awareness of loss, and added to the paradox of her life. She was adored by millions, yet profoundly alone, celebrated as a goddess, yet burdened as a woman. She laughed louder, perhaps, because she knew the silence that followed laughter too well. She shone brighter, perhaps, because she had seen how swiftly light could be extinguished. And so we leave her in this moment, a widow at 21, standing at the threshold of her greatest fame, her heart marked by a tragedy that the world consumed as scandal, but she bore as sorrow. The echo lingers, muffled but unending, shaping the contours of her story. She steps back onto the set, into the glare of lamps, into the lines of a new script. She laughs, she sparkles, she dazzles once more. Yet within her, the faint reverberation of that sound remains, a whisper that even amid applause and light, silence and shadow are never far away. Flashbulbs still burning after the crowd departs leave behind a strange ghost of brightness. The room empties, voices fade, footsteps recede, but in the eyes of those who stood before the blinding white explosions, the light lingers, leaving spots and shadows that refuse to disappear. For Jean, the aftermath of Paul Bern's death was just such a lingering brightness, searing, intrusive, impossible to escape. The flashbulbs of reporters, clicking without mercy in the days following the tragedy, remained in her vision long after the photographers had gone, a cruel reminder that even her deepest grief was not her own to carry quietly. The studio, ever watchful of reputation, moved swiftly to manage the narrative. MGM understood that Jean was too valuable a star to be left vulnerable to scandal, and so they surrounded her with a wall of protection. Press statements were carefully worded, interviews orchestrated, appearances controlled. Executives reassured the public that she was innocent, that she bore no blame, that her only role was that of grieving widow. Yet even as the studio sought to shield her, the press continued to circle like vultures, hungry for details, for contradictions, for hints of salacious truth that could sell another day's paper. and the flashbulbs kept burning, even in silence, their glare following her into every room, every corner of her life. For Jean herself, the weight of this scrutiny was immense. She was not allowed the simple dignity of mourning in private. Her tears were captured by cameras, her sorrow dissected by columnists, her every gesture interpreted as signal. If she smiled, she was accused of indifference. If she wept, she was accused of dramatizing. If she remained silent, she was accused of hiding guilt. No expression of grief was safe from judgment, and so she learned, quickly and painfully, to mask her feelings, to smile when expected, to laugh when required, to speak words that deflected rather than revealed. The woman who once longed to be truly seen found herself more invisible than ever, her truth erased by the shadows cast by others' assumptions. Friends noticed the strain. They saw how her laughter sometimes faltered, how her eyes sometimes dimmed when conversation turned to burn. They knew that behind her dazzling presence lay wounds that had not healed. Yet they also admired her resilience, her refusal to collapse entirely beneath the weight of scandal. She threw herself into her work, arriving on set with the same professionalism as always, delivering performances that sparkled with life, even when her own spirit was heavy. Perhaps it was her way of surviving, of reclaiming some part of herself from the glare of unwanted attention. For on screen, at least, she had some measure of control, some space to transform pain into art, even if the art itself was wrapped once more in the image of the platinum blonde. The public, meanwhile, remained divided. Many continued to adore her, seeing in her performances the same wit and vitality they had always loved. They pitied her too, recognizing at least the surface of her sorrow. Others, however, whispered still of scandal, convinced that there was more to the story than the studio allowed. The ambiguity of Paul Bern's note, the unanswered questions surrounding his past, the abruptness of his death, all of it fed a narrative that refused to die. And because Jean was at the center, her life remained entangled in shadows not of her making. No matter what she said or did, the flashbulbs burned on, illuminating her as symbol rather than woman. Within herself, she carried the contradictions. She mourned, she endured, she sought to continue living, to continue loving, to continue being more than the tragedy that had claimed her. But the world would not let her forget. Even as new roles came, even as laughter once more bubbled from audiences in theaters, the whispers of scandal trailed her like a faint echo. Perhaps this was why she leaned more heavily into humor, why she laughed so often in interviews, why she spoke with a wit that disarmed rather than revealed. Humor became her shield, laughter her disguise, sparkle her survival. Beneath it all, the grief remained, but hidden behind the mask, the world demanded she wear. Hollywood itself was complicit in this paradox. The same system that had consumed her husband now demanded that she continue, polished, radiant, undimmed. There was no pause allowed for sorrow, no time to step away. Films were waiting, contracts binding, audiences expectant. To stop would have been to risk fading, and fading was a fate worse than grief. So she pressed forward, her platinum crown gleaming, her laughter ringing, her performances unbroken. To the world she seemed resilient, triumphant even, proof that tragedy could not extinguish her. To herself, she was surviving, but at a cost known only in the quietest hours. The image of flashbulbs still burning after the crowd departs lingers as we consider her at this stage of her life. She smiles for the cameras, she steps into limousines, she attends premieres. The lights explode, leaving after images that follow her long into the night. When the photographers leave, when the crowd disperses, when silence returns, the brightness remains in her vision, haunting her. A reminder of how inescapable the gaze of the world had become. She closes her eyes, but still she sees them. She opens them again, and the lights are waiting once more. And so we leave her here, caught between grief and performance, between tragedy and triumph, between the truth she lived and the image she could not escape. The flashbulbs still burn, long after the crowd is gone, long after the laughter has faded. Their ghostly light follows her into the next day, the next film, the next chapter. How long, one wonders, can a woman live beneath lights that never truly go out? Laughter echoing faintly in an empty theater is a sound that holds both joy and sorrow. In the moment of performance, laughter is full, vibrant, a living response that warms the heart of the one who hears it. But when the audience has gone, when only shadows remain on the seats, the faint echo lingers like a memory, reminding one of the transience of joy. For Jean, that faint echo became the sound of her resilience. In the wake of scandal, in the shadow of grief, she returned again and again to the screen, where her wit and charm drew laughter from audiences who never knew how fragile her own laughter truly was. The years following Paul Bern's death could have ended her career. Many actresses entangled in scandal had vanished from Hollywood, their names erased by whispers too loud to silence. Yet Jean endured. MGM, recognizing her unique power, refused to let her fade. They placed her in roles designed to restore her image, films that showcased her humor, her vitality, her dazzling presence. And Jean, with remarkable strength, embraced them. She laughed on screen with a brightness that concealed her sorrow. She delivered lines with a sparkle that belied her grief. She gave audiences reason to forget whispers and remember only her charm. The laughter in theaters was real, even if the echo within her heart was faint. Her comedic talent became increasingly evident during these years. In Dinner at 8, she played Kitty Packard, a woman of frivolous airs and sharp humor, and stole scenes from even the most seasoned actors. Audiences adored her timing, her playful delivery, the way she seemed to breathe life into lines that might otherwise have fallen flat. Critics, though still divided, began to acknowledge her gift for comedy. She was not merely a pretty face, not merely a platinum image, but an actress with instinct and intelligence. Yet even this recognition carried its paradox, for while her skill was acknowledged, it was acknowledged within the narrow frame of humor and scandal, not within the breadth of dramatic artistry she longed to explore. Jean herself cherished these successes, for they reminded her that she had value beyond the gossip columns. On set, she was surrounded by colleagues who respected her, who admired her professionalism, who found in her not only beauty but camaraderie. Clark Gable, her frequent co-star, spoke of her ability to hold her own against him, to match his presence with her own. Directors praised her reliability, her willingness to learn, her natural ease before the camera. In private moments, she laughed with her friends, enjoyed small joys, sought comfort and companionship, yet always beneath the laughter there was the faint echo of emptiness, the awareness that joy on screen could not entirely heal sorrow off it. Her mother remained her anchor, ever present, ever protective. Mother Jean accompanied her to sets, guided her choices, shielded her as best she could from the harsher intrusions of fame. Their bond, though intense, gave Jean both comfort and constraint. She loved her mother deeply, relied upon her for support, yet also felt the weight of her expectations. The image of Jean Harlow was not only her own creation, but also the fulfillment of her mother's long-held ambitions. To succeed was to honor that bond. To falter was to risk disappointing the one person who had never left her side. And so she pressed on, through laughter and sorrow alike, carrying within her both gratitude and burden. The public, for its part, continued to adore her. Her films drew crowds. Her name guaranteed attention. Her presence was celebrated across the nation. In the midst of economic hardship, when the depression weighed heavily upon so many lives, Jean offered escape. Her laughter lifted spirits. Her glamour distracted from despair. Her boldness suggested possibilities beyond constraint. She became not only a star, but a symbol of endurance, of defiance against the weight of circumstance. Yet this role, too, carried cost. For to embody hope for others is to risk emptiness for oneself, to give so much outwardly that little remains inwardly. Perhaps this was why the laughter she inspired so often echoed faintly within her, a reminder that the joy she gave was not always the joy she felt. Still, she continued. She accepted roles, delivered performances, embraced the machinery of Hollywood even as it consumed her. She grew more skilled, more confident, more capable of carrying entire films upon her presence. She became not only the platinum blonde, but also the queen of screwball comedy, the woman who could turn scandal into laughter, who could transform sorrow into sparkle. And in doing so, she secured her place in history, even as her own heart remained restless. The laughter in theaters was full and true, but in the empty seats afterward, in the quiet of her dressing room, the echo was faint, fragile, fleeting. And so we leave her here, triumphant yet haunted, beloved yet misunderstood. She stands on the stage of cinema, delivering lines that send audiences into fits of laughter, her platinum hair gleaming under the lamps, her eyes alight with wit. The applause follows, the theaters resound, the laughter fills the air. Then the audience departs, the lights dim, the seats are empty. The laughter echoes faintly, lingering for a moment before fading into silence. She hears it, smiles perhaps, sighs perhaps, wonders perhaps whether laughter alone can sustain a heart. How long, one wonders, can the echo of joy fill the emptiness that remains when the theater is dark? Perfume lingering in an empty room is a trace both delicate and haunting. It suggests presence, warmth, the intimacy of nearness, yet it remains after the one who wore it has gone, leaving only memory upon the air. For Jean, love often carried this same quality, moments of fragrance, tenderness, and laughter that filled her heart briefly before dissolving into absence. She longed for companionship, for a hand to hold in the midst of constant glare, for someone to see her not as image or icon, but simply as Jean. And though she found such moments, though she cherished them, they so often proved fleeting, like perfume vanishing though its memory remained. In the years after Bern's death, whispers of her romances filled the papers as eagerly as they had once devoured her scandals. She was linked with co-stars, with producers, with men of wealth and prominence. Some rumors were fabrications, inventions of journalists who knew her name would sell a headline. Others held fragments of truth, for Jean was not without longing, not without desire for love. Among her most noted companions was William Powell, the sophisticated actor whose elegance and wit matched her own in kind. Their connection was genuine, a meeting of humor and intelligence, affection and respect. To many who observed them, Powell seemed the one who might finally bring Jean the stability and tenderness she so often sought. With Powell, Jean found comfort in laughter, in shared jokes, in evenings of quiet companionship away from the flashbulbs. He admired her not only as a star, but as a woman of warmth, quick wit, and resilience. She, in turn, admired his steadiness, his sophistication, his ability to treat her as more than the bombshell image that clung to her like armor. Their bond grew, tender and real, and for a time she seemed to glow with a happiness unbound from scandal. Friends remarked upon the lightness of her spirit in his presence, the genuine smiles that came without the effort of performance. And yet even here, even in love, shadows lingered. For Powell, already established, carried his own hesitations, his own complexities, and though their bond was deep, it never found permanence in marriage. The perfume lingered, but the room grew empty once more. Jean's longing for love was not a weakness, but an expression of her humanity. She was a woman of enormous vitality, of wit and sparkle, Yet beneath it all, she yearned for the same tenderness every soul seeks. The paradox of her fame was that while millions adored her, while men across the world dreamed of her, the simple affection of a single enduring partner remained elusive. Each romance, whether rumor or reality, ended with a trace of perfume, a memory cherished but incomplete. Did she ever sit quietly after a party, after a night of laughter, inhaling the faint scent of perfume upon her dress, and wonder why love seemed always to vanish, leaving her with absence where presence once had been? The tabloids, as ever, made sport of her affairs, twisting tenderness into scandal, affection into spectacle. They spoke of her as though love were a game she played recklessly, as though her heart were a trophy to be won by one man after another. Yet those who truly knew her spoke differently. They described a woman who gave of herself sincerely, who longed for stability, who was deeply loyal when she felt truly seen. They spoke of her generosity, her laughter that filled rooms, her warmth that made friends feel cherished. She was no cold seductress, no manipulator of affections. She was a woman searching for what so many search for, a love strong enough to withstand the glare of the world. Her relationship with Powell, though it never ended in marriage, remained one of the most meaningful of her life. He was with her in moments of health and in moments of illness, in times of laughter and of sorrow. His presence offered her a measure of solace in a world that so often misunderstood her. Yet even this, even the tenderness of Powell, could not fully protect her from the loneliness that lingered when the perfume of companionship faded. She belonged always, unavoidably, to the public, and the public's gaze was a constant third presence in every romance. Few men could withstand it. Fewer still could accept it without hesitation. And so, again and again, the intimacy she sought dissolved, leaving only fragrance in its wake. Still, she cherished what she had. Jean was not one to wallow endlessly in despair. She laughed, she embraced, she delighted in moments of joy even if they were brief. She attended gatherings, she charmed friends, she danced, she filled rooms with warmth. Those who were close to her often forgot she was a star, for she was so easy, so genuine, so quick to share herself without pretense. If love could not be permanent, she embraced it in fragments, savoring the perfume even when it faded. In this way, she lived richly, if not always securely, giving of her heart even when it risked being broken. The image of perfume lingering in an empty room captures the paradox of Jean's romantic life. She was surrounded by love, yet often left alone, adored by many, yet longing for one, radiant in company, yet pensive in solitude. Each romance was real, each companionship sincere, but each ended too soon, leaving her with memories that clung like faint fragrance long after the presence had gone. Perhaps it was her fate, perhaps the cost of being so adored by the world, or perhaps it was simply the human condition, magnified by fame, that made love so elusive. And so we leave her here, in a room where laughter has faded, where perfume still lingers though its source has gone. She sits quietly, perhaps smiling at a memory, perhaps sighing at its absence, perhaps grateful for even the fleeting fragrance of love. Around her, the world continues to speculate, to invent stories, to imagine scandals. But here, in this empty room, there is only the faint sweetness of memory, delicate and haunting. How long can a heart be sustained by fragrance alone, by traces of what once was, by perfume that lingers but never remains? The sound of a heartbeat slowing is not always heard in the chest, but often felt in the stillness of the body, in the pauses between breaths, in the weariness that no rest seems able to cure. For Jean, whose life had been lived so brightly, whose laughter had seemed inexhaustible, the slowing of her heart began subtly, almost imperceptibly. It was in the fatigue that lingered even after sleep, in the faint pallor of her skin beneath the lamps, in the heaviness of limbs that once danced with effortless vitality. At first, she dismissed it, attributing her weariness to long days on set, to endless demands, to the simple exhaustion of being forever in the spotlight. But beneath the surface, something deeper stirred, a shadow that neither she nor those around her fully understood. Her health, fragile in ways hidden from view, began to falter in the mid-1930s. The studios, eager to maintain her image as radiant goddess, ignored or concealed the signs. To them, she was still the platinum blonde who could light a screen with a smile, and any whisper of weakness threatened the illusion. Makeup artists worked harder, cinematographers adjusted lighting, publicity agents reassured the press that she was well. Yet those closest to her noticed the change. Friends remarked that she tired more easily, that she sometimes struggled to complete a scene, that her laughter, though still present, carried a faint trace of strain. Her mother, ever protective, worried quietly, though she too perhaps clung to denial, unwilling to acknowledge fragility in the daughter she had so long molded for greatness. Jean herself was reluctant to admit illness. To confess weakness was to risk losing the career that defined her, the applause that sustained her, the identity that the world demanded she embody. And so she pressed on, resilient as always, delivering performances with wit and sparkle, even as her body betrayed her. In Reckless and Susie, she played women of daring and resilience, and audiences believed in her vitality because they wished to believe. Yet behind the scenes, she fainted more than once. Her strength faltered, her once bright energy dimmed. Doctors were consulted, treatments attempted, but the true cause, the silent decline of her kidneys, remained unrecognized or unspoken. Medicine of the time offered little clarity and even less cure. There is a sorrow in watching vitality fade, not in sudden collapse, but in gradual diminishment. Jean, who had so often lit up rooms with her presence, found herself sometimes seated quietly in corners, conserving strength. She, who once sparkled with irrepressible humor, grew more contemplative, her silences longer, her sighs deeper. Yet she did not surrender her spirit. She continued to arrive on set, to deliver performances, to laugh with friends, to offer the world the image it so desperately craved. If her heart slowed, her courage did not. She carried on as though sheer will could defy the shadows gathering within. The public, of course, remained unaware. They saw only the goddess of the screen, the bombshell whose platinum hair gleamed, whose laughter filled theaters, whose image adorned posters and magazines. To them, she was untouched by mortality, eternal in beauty, invincible in allure. And perhaps Jean took solace in this illusion, for to be remembered in vitality is a form of immortality. Yet illusions cannot heal the body, and each passing month brought greater evidence that her strength was fading. Her skin lost its glow, her figure its ease, her movements their lightness. Still, she persisted, a testament to resilience even as her body betrayed her. Her relationship with William Powell during these years offered comfort. He stood by her with quiet devotion, supporting her through moments of weakness, offering laughter when hers faltered. His steadiness gave her solace, his affection warmth. Yet even he could not shield her from the inevitable. Love can soothe the heart, but it cannot restore failing organs, cannot reverse the slow decline of a body under siege. And so, even surrounded by tenderness, she remained vulnerable, fragile, beneath the armor of glamour. The sound of a heartbeat slowing became the rhythm of her days, a quiet reminder that time was not endless, that the brilliance of her light might not burn forever. Yet Jean, ever courageous, refused to let it dim her spirit. She laughed when she could, worked when she was able, cherished the company of friends, embraced the affection of Powell, leaned on the strength of her mother. She lived each day as fully as her fading health allowed, and in doing so, she carved for herself a dignity that scandal and rumor could not touch. She became, in those years, not merely the bombshell the world adored, but a woman of resilience, of grace, of quiet courage. We leave her here, in the soft stillness of an evening, seated perhaps in her home, her laughter quieter than before, her gaze thoughtful, her body weary. The sound of her heartbeat, slowing yet steady, fills the silence around her. She breathes deeply, inhales perhaps the faint trace of perfume, still lingering from an earlier moment of joy, exhales into the quiet that surrounds her. The world still believes her invincible, eternal, untouchable. But here, in this room, she is simply Jean, fragile and brave, luminous even in weariness. How long, one wonders, can brilliance endure when the body that carries it begins to falter? How long can a heart continue, slowing yet resilient, against the tide of decline? The clatter of a dropped script on the floor is the kind of sound that startles a quiet room. It interrupts the rhythm of conversation, the hum of lamps, the shuffle of footsteps, and in that sudden break, all eyes turn toward the fallen pages. For Jean, the sound of a script slipping from her hands became not only a moment of accident, but a symbol of something deeper. The weight of words she could no longer easily carry, the fragility of strength she once commanded, the visible proof that her health was failing in ways no laughter or makeup could conceal. On the set of Saratoga, her final film, the clatter of scripts was heard more than once, as fatigue overcame her, as her body faltered before the relentless demands of Hollywood. By this time, the strain was evident to those around her. She had grown weaker, her once bright vitality dulled by illness that neither she nor her doctors fully named. Yet she persisted, determined to fulfill her contracts, to give her audience what they expected, to prove to herself that she was still capable. Each day on set was a test of will. The lamps burned hot above her, the cameras whirred with indifference, the crew moved with quiet efficiency. And there she stood, the platinum blonde, her hair still gleaming, her smile still radiant, her laughter still written into the lines. But behind the glamour, exhaustion clung to her shoulders like an invisible weight, pulling her downward even as she tried to stand tall. Her co-stars noticed. Clark Gable, her frequent partner on screen, watched with concern as she faltered, as her steps slowed, as she leaned against props between takes for support. He admired her courage, her insistence on working despite the pain, but he saw too the fragility that fame could not disguise. The director, George Cukor, adjusted schedules, shortened her scenes, tried to ease the burden, but there was only so much that could be done. Hollywood was a machine that moved forward regardless of the strength of those within it, and Jean, despite her weakening body, remained one of its most valuable cogs. The irony of Saratoga was not lost on those who observed. The film was a romantic comedy, light in tone, filled with banter and charm. Jean's role demanded sparkle, quick wit, playful energy, the very qualities that illness was slowly stealing from her. And yet she delivered. Somehow, between bouts of weakness, she summoned the vitality audiences adored. Her timing remained sharp, her delivery crisp, her presence luminous. It was as though sheer willpower lifted her, carrying her through scenes her body could no longer easily perform. The clatter of the drop script was real, but so too was the brilliance she still managed to give. Behind the scenes, however, the concern deepened. The makeup artists applied heavier powders to disguise the pallor of her skin. The cinematographers softened the lights, adjusted angles, sought to conceal the traces of fatigue etched upon her features. Wardrobe tailored her gowns to fit a body that was thinning, growing fragile. Everyone around her, from grips to leading men, felt the unease, the sense that something more serious was unfolding than mere exhaustion. Yet no one could speak it aloud, for to name illness was to acknowledge mortality, and Hollywood had no place for mortality in the figure of Jean Harlow. Jean herself sensed it, though she rarely admitted it openly. She spoke of feeling unwell, of needing rest, of longing for quieter days, but she also insisted on continuing. To stop would have been to surrender not only her role but her identity, for she had been fashioned as an image of vitality, of resilience, of unyielding glamour. To confess that she could not carry on was to risk the unraveling of everything she and her mother and the studios had built. And so she pressed forward page by page, scene by scene, even as scripts slipped from her weary hands. Those closest to her noticed the deeper signs. Her laughter, though still present, often came with effort. Her eyes dimmed more quickly, her movements slowed. She sometimes stumbled, sometimes winced at pains she could not disguise, sometimes closed her eyes as though gathering strength simply to remain standing. And yet, when the camera rolled, she transformed. The platinum blonde smiled, teased, charmed, sparkled, just as audiences expected. It was a performance not only of a character, but of herself, an act of courage in the face of decline, a testament to her devotion to the craft and to those who loved her on screen. The clatter of a dropped script thus became a haunting rhythm on set. Each time it fell, each time she bent to retrieve it with trembling hands, those around her held their breath, wondering how much longer she could continue. The sound echoed in the silence that followed, a reminder that even the brightest stars cannot escape the weight of the body, the pull of mortality. And yet, Jean smiled, reassured her colleagues, insisted she would be fine. She laughed at her own weakness, turning frailty into jest, refusing to let sorrow dominate the room. It was her gift, her shield, her way of making even illness seem less daunting. Still, beneath the laughter, there was fear. She must have felt it herself in the slowing of her heartbeat, in the heaviness of her limbs, in the shadows that crept across her days. She had faced scandal. She had endured grief. She had survived loneliness. But illness was different. It was not a story to be managed, not a rumor to be laughed away. It was within her, silent, inexorable, indifferent to fame or beauty. And though she resisted, though she persisted, the truth was undeniable. The clatter of the script was the sound of time slipping from her grasp. We leave her here, on the set of Saratoga, the lamps burning hot above, the cameras ready, the crew hushed in anticipation. She holds her script, lines marked, laughter rehearsed, smile prepared. But her hands tremble, her strength falters, and the pages slip, falling to the floor with a hollow clatter. All eyes turn, concern unspoken, silence heavy. She bends, retrieves the script, smiles, and says lightly, "Clumsy me." The crew laughs softly, relieved, and the work continues. Yet the sound of the clatter lingers, echoing faintly in the hearts of all who heard it. How many more times, one wonders, could she retrieve the pages before they slipped beyond her reach entirely? Curtains drawn across a window soften the light, dimming the brightness of day until the room feels suspended between time and shadow. They are drawn for privacy, for rest, for concealment, and when they fall heavy against the glass, the world outside is muted, distant, unreal. For Jean, the curtains drawn across the hospital window marked the beginning of her last chapter, a separation between the glamour of the world she had inhabited and the silence of the world she now entered. No longer was she the platinum goddess beneath the heat of lamps. She was simply a woman in a bed, pale, fragile, struggling for breath as illness claimed what fame could never protect. The decline had come swiftly, though its signs had been present for years. Fatigue that would not ease, fainting spells that grew more frequent, a complexion dulled by more than exhaustion. On the set of Saratoga, her weakness had become impossible to ignore, and when she collapsed, her colleagues knew at last that she could not continue. The studio, reluctant to acknowledge her frailty, allowed her absence only when necessity left no choice. She was admitted to Good Samaritan Hospital in Los Angeles, where doctors murmured diagnoses, where her mother hovered like a sentinel, where William Powell visited quietly, grief already etched upon his face. The curtains were drawn, shutting out the sunlit boulevards of Hollywood, shutting out the noise of reporters, shutting out the world that had claimed her so completely. Within those walls, her body revealed the truth it had long concealed: kidney failure, advanced and merciless. In an age before dialysis, before transplants, before modern treatments, such a diagnosis was almost always fatal. The doctors could do little beyond easing her pain, offering comfort, watching as her once bright vitality faded. To her mother, the reality was unbearable. Mother Jean had built her daughter's destiny, guided her every step, defended her fiercely, believed in her invincibility. To see her lying there, her golden child dimmed, was a sorrow deeper than words could contain. She held her hand, whispered encouragements, refused to surrender to despair, even as the truth pressed in, like the heavy curtains drawn across the glass. Jean herself must have known. She had faced scandal, endured grief, conquered criticism, survived loneliness, but illness was different. It stripped away the defenses she had worn so skillfully, left her with no role to play, no mask to hide behind. Her laughter, once her shield, was faint now, her smile thin, her body weary. Yet even here, even in the shadow of death, she displayed a courage that was uniquely hers. She comforted her mother, reassured her friends, greeted visitors with a gentleness that concealed her suffering. She did not rage. She did not despair openly. She bore her fate with quiet dignity, as though she knew that her light, though fading in the body, would remain in memory. William Powell visited often, slipping into the room with tenderness that words cannot fully capture. He had loved her with a steadiness rare in her tumultuous life, and now he stood by her in the final days, holding her hand, offering what comfort he could. Friends later recalled his grief, how deeply he mourned her, how he carried her memory for the rest of his life. For Jean, his presence must have been solace, proof that she was loved not as a star but as a woman, not as an image but as herself. The perfume of that love lingered even as the room filled with the scent of antiseptic, even as the curtains kept the world at bay. Outside, the press clamored. Reporters lingered at the gates of the hospital, hungry for updates, for photographs, for the story of a goddess brought low by mortality. Headlines speculated, whispered, mourned prematurely. The public, too, held its breath. Fans wrote letters, prayed, hoped against hope that the platinum blonde who had brought them laughter would recover. Yet within the hospital room, the truth was already known. Jean was slipping away, her body unable to sustain her, her heart slowing, her breaths shallower each day. The world beyond the curtains might still hope, but those within knew the end was near. In those last days, Jean spoke softly, often with humor that surprised those around her. She joked gently with nurses, teased her mother, offered lightness even as she weakened. It was as though she wished to ease the burden of those who loved her, to ensure that their last memories of her were not of sorrow, but of her indomitable spirit. Her beauty, though diminished by illness, still glowed faintly, the trace of radiance that no disease could fully erase. Her platinum hair, though unstyled, caught the dim light of the room, reminding all who entered that this was still Jean, still luminous, even in decline. The curtains drawn across the window marked the separation between two worlds. Outside, the world of glamour, noise and illusion. Inside, the world of truth, silence and farewell. For those who stood beside her bed, it was a painful privilege to witness her courage, to share her final days, to honor her with their presence. For Jean, it was a passage not chosen but endured, a final role she did not perform but lived with dignity. We leave her here, in the stillness of that room, the curtains heavy, the light dimmed, her mother at her side, Powell near. Friends and doctors moving softly. She lies in bed, fragile yet luminous, her eyes half closed, her breath measured, her body weakening. The world outside clamors for news, the press speculates, the fans hope. But within these walls, time moves differently, slower, gentler, heavier. The curtains are drawn, and behind them, Jean Harlow, the platinum blonde, lives her final days with a grace that scandal cannot touch, that rumor cannot stain, that fame cannot define. How long, one wonders, can a heart beat against the weight of fate when even the light of day is dimmed by curtains drawn? The last breath dissolving into silence is not a single moment, but a slow fading, a pause that stretches longer than the one before until the air itself seems to hold still. In that pause, time hesitates, waiting for a sound that will not return. For Jean, the last breath came on the morning of June 7, 1937, in a quiet hospital room where curtains shut out the world and where the presence of those who loved her gave shape to the silence. She was only 26, still luminous in the eyes of millions, still a star at the height of her fame, and yet her body had yielded. Her heart slowed beyond recovery, her kidneys stilled in their silent rebellion. Her mother was there, as she had been since the very beginning, holding her daughter's hand as though sheer force of devotion might anchor her to life. Mother Jean, who had dreamed her daughter into stardom, who had stood by her through scandal and triumph alike, now sat at her bedside, powerless against an illness that no will could command. She whispered softly, words of comfort, prayers half-spoken, fragments of lullabies from childhood perhaps. To watch the light fade from the one she had so fiercely guarded was a grief beyond imagining, yet she remained resolute, unwilling to let her daughter slip away unaccompanied. William Powell came too, quiet in his grief, his presence heavy with unspoken sorrow. He had loved her with steadiness, admired her wit, cherished her warmth, and now he stood helpless as life ebbed from her. Friends later recalled that Powell's grief lasted long beyond those hours, that he carried the memory of Jean with him for the rest of his life, never quite able to replace her. For in her laughter, in her courage, in her fragility, he had seen something irreplaceable, something rare, and so he remained near, honoring her in the only way left, to be present as she slipped from this world. The doctors moved softly, their hands gentle, their words hushed. In an era without cures, their role was not to save but to ease, to watch, to acknowledge what could not be stopped. They measured her pulse. They listened to her slowing heart. They nodded gravely as silence began to claim the room. Nurses adjusted sheets, whispered instructions, stepped back into shadows. There was no drama, no sudden cry, only the quiet inevitability of life yielding to death. The world outside still imagined her radiant on screen, but within those walls she was a young woman lying in stillness, her breaths fewer, her eyes half closed, her body at last exhausted. What thoughts passed through her mind in those final hours? No one can say. Did she recall her childhood in Kansas City, the warmth of familiar rooms, the guiding hand of her mother? Did she remember the thrill of her first close-up, the sparkle of laughter in theaters, the moments of applause that lifted her spirit? Did she think of love, of Powell's steady presence, of Bern's tragic absence, of fleeting perfumes that lingered only as memory? Or did she simply drift, her mind loosening its grip as her body surrendered, her spirit carried gently beyond the curtain of breath? We cannot know, and perhaps it is better that way, for mystery itself holds dignity where intrusion cannot. When the silence finally deepened, when her last breath dissolved into stillness, the room changed. The presence of her absence was palpable. Her mother, still holding her hand, wept quietly, refusing at first to release what was no longer there. Powell bowed his head, grief heavy, unable to speak. The doctors nodded solemnly, the nurses lowered their eyes. Outside, the world had not yet learned. Outside, theaters still advertised her films. Posters still bore her gleaming smile. Fans still planned to see her in Saratoga. For a brief moment, only those in the room knew the truth, that the platinum blonde, luminous and daring, had departed forever. News traveled quickly. Within hours, the silence of the hospital was replaced by the noise of headlines, of radio broadcasts, of voices speaking her name in shock. Hollywood itself seemed to pause, as though stunned that such brilliance could vanish so suddenly. Studios halted. Actors wept. Fans across the nation mourned. Letters poured in. Flowers arrived in endless bouquets. Tributes were spoken in hushed voices. At 26, Jean Harlow was gone, and yet her presence lingered everywhere, in reels still playing, in posters still shining, in memories still vivid. Her last breath had dissolved, but her image remained, eternal upon the silver screen. For those who loved her, the silence after her passing was heavier than applause, heavier than scandal, heavier than the rustle of newspapers or the clatter of scripts. It was the silence of absence, the kind that cannot be filled, the kind that lingers in every room where laughter once rang. Mother Jean withdrew into grief, guarding her daughter's memory as fiercely as she had guarded her life. Powell carried sorrow quietly, never fully speaking of it but never escaping it. Friends spoke of her with tenderness, recalling her humor, her warmth, her generosity. They remembered not the bombshell image, but the woman who teased them, who cared for them, who laughed with them in moments untouched by fame. The last breath dissolving into silence thus became more than the end of a life. It became the opening of a legacy. For in that silence, the world realized the depth of what it had lost, and in realizing it, began to immortalize her. Jean had burned too brightly to be forgotten, and though her body yielded, her image, her laughter, her spirit lived on in celluloid, in memory, in the collective imagination of an era that would forever call her its first true goddess of the screen. We leave her here in the stillness of that room, her mother's hand holding hers, Powell's presence heavy with grief, the curtains drawn against the light. The silence is complete now, yet within it lingers an echo of laughter, a shimmer of platinum, a trace of perfume. Outside, the world stirs, unaware for a moment longer, soon to be shattered by the news. Within, there is only quiet, the last breath dissolved, the silence profound. And we ask, as we step back from this moment, what is it to live so brightly that the end feels impossible, and yet to die so young that silence itself seems too soon? Flowers wilting upon marble stone tell their story in silence. Their colors, once vivid, fade beneath the weight of sun and time. Their fragrance, once sweet, thins into the air until it is no more. They rest upon cold stone as offerings of love and memory, yet they too cannot endure. At Jean's funeral, flowers were brought in such abundance that the scent overwhelmed the air. Lilies and roses stacked high, chrysanthemums and carnations filling the space like a living sea. They were tokens of grief, of reverence, of shock, and as they wilted upon marble, they bore witness to the truth that even the brightest bloom, even the most radiant star, must one day fade. Hollywood itself seemed to fall still in those days. Production slowed, premieres dimmed, conversations hushed. Actors, directors, and studio heads who so often lived at a frenetic pace paused to acknowledge the loss of a woman whose presence had defined a moment in cinema. Clark Gable, her frequent co-star, was said to have wept openly, his grief unguarded, for he had shared laughter with her both on screen and off, and her absence left a hollow space he could not deny. William Powell moved quietly through the rituals of mourning, his sorrow written not in words, but in the heaviness of his bearing. Friends gathered in disbelief, recalling her jokes, her warmth, her light-hearted mischief, unable to reconcile the memory of her laughter with the stillness of her absence. The funeral itself drew crowds beyond counting. Fans lined the streets, their faces solemn, many weeping openly though they had never known her. For to them, Jean was not only an actress, but a companion through the darkest years of the Depression, a bright figure whose wit and vitality had offered escape from despair. They came with flowers clutched in hands, with prayers whispered softly, with eyes lowered in reverence. The procession moved slowly, the casket gleaming, the air heavy with grief, and above it all the California sky stretched indifferent, as though the heavens themselves could not be moved by the sorrow that gripped the city below. The press, relentless even in death, recorded every detail. Newspapers filled their pages with accounts of the funeral, with tributes, with photographs of the grieving. Some wrote with sincerity, honoring her memory. Others could not resist weaving her passing into narratives of scandal. For even in death, Jean was subject to the distortions of fame. Yet amid the noise of headlines, the truth remained simple. A young woman of 26, luminous and beloved, had been taken too soon. The flowers wilting upon marble spoke this truth more honestly than any column could. For her mother, the grief was immeasurable. Mother Jean had built her daughter's life as carefully as a sculptor carves marble, had shaped her path with relentless devotion, had guarded her fiercely against harm. To outlive her child was a fate she could scarcely endure. She withdrew into mourning, her home filled with memories, her days haunted by absence. She spoke often of Jean in the years that followed, defending her memory, preserving her image, ensuring that the world remembered not scandal, but brilliance. Yet even as she did so, the ache of loss never left her, as constant and cold as the marble stone that bore her daughter's name. For Powell, too, the loss lingered. He never forgot Jean, carrying her memory in silence through the decades that followed. Though he continued his career, though he found companionship again, those who knew him understood that Jean had left a mark upon his heart that could not be erased. She had been, in her brief years, a source of laughter, of tenderness, of warmth he never quite found elsewhere. The wilted flowers of her funeral remained, in a sense, fresh in his memory always, their fragrance a ghost he carried within him. Fans across the nation mourned as though they had lost someone close. Letters poured in by the thousands, tributes written by strangers who felt they had known her through the screen. They spoke of how her films had lifted them in dark times, how her laughter had given them joy when little else could, how her presence had made their lives brighter. To them, she was not merely a star, but a companion, a symbol of resilience and daring, a light against despair. Her death, sudden and senseless, left them grieving not only for her, but for the fragility of the hope she represented. And so, amid marble and flowers, amid prayers and weeping, Jean was laid to rest. Yet even as her body was given to the earth, her image lived on. Films continued to play in theaters. Her voice continued to echo from screens. Her laughter continued to ripple through darkened rooms. For audiences who entered theaters in the weeks after her passing, there was a strange dissonance. They watched her alive, vibrant, sparkling, even as they knew she was gone. The screen became both shrine and illusion, preserving her even as it reminded them of her absence. The flowers upon marble wilted, but her image did not. In this paradox lay the essence of her legacy. Jean Harlow, the woman, had departed, her heart silenced, her body gone. But Jean Harlow, the star, remained, immortal upon celluloid, frozen in youth, radiant forever. The public mourned, but they also remembered, and in remembering, they kept her alive in ways that defied the silence of the grave. She became not only a memory, but a myth, her story told in whispers, her name etched into the fabric of Hollywood history. We leave her here, among flowers that wilt and marble that endures, mourned by a city that paused in its relentless pace to honor her. The scent of lilies lingers faintly in the air, the petals fall, the bouquets fade. Yet in the minds of those who loved her, who laughed with her in darkened theaters, who wept at the news of her death, she remains luminous. The flowers wilt, but the memory does not. And we ask, as we gaze upon the marble and the fading blossoms, what is the nature of remembrance? When beauty fades, but image endures. A reel spinning endlessly without end is the sound of memory preserved. It whirs in the darkness of a theater booth, celluloid threading through metal wheels, light bursting from its frames onto the silver screen. Each loop repeats what is already gone. Each flicker returns to life what the world has lost. For Jean, who departed so young, the reel became her eternity. Though her body lay beneath marble, though flowers upon her grave wilted, the reels of her film spun on, projecting her laughter, her wit, her sparkle into the lives of generations who would never know her in flesh, yet felt they knew her through light. Her legacy began not in stillness, but in motion, for cinema has the power to capture vitality as though it were unending. Audiences who entered theaters after her death found themselves confronted by the strange paradox of her presence. There she was, alive, radiant, delivering lines with perfect timing, her platinum hair gleaming, her smile irresistible. Yet they knew she was gone. Her last breath dissolved into silence only days before. The reel spun on endlessly, but time outside the projector refused to follow. This paradox gave her legacy a haunting quality, for she became at once eternal and unreachable, alive forever, and yet lost forever. Hollywood, shaken by her passing, sought to preserve her in its own way. MGM completed Saratoga using doubles and careful editing, allowing audiences to see her final performance. It became both tribute and farewell, a film that shimmered with the vitality of Jean, even as it carried the shadow of her absence. Viewers wept openly, laughter mingling with tears, for they knew they were witnessing not only entertainment, but remembrance. The reel spun endlessly, but the hands that had once dropped its script now lay still. In the years that followed, critics began to reappraise her work. What had once been dismissed as mere scandal or surface allure was reconsidered with deeper respect. They saw in her timing a precision that rivaled the best comedians, in her expressions a depth that revealed more than words, in her presence a vitality that no studio could manufacture. They acknowledged what her audiences had always known, that Jean was not simply a bombshell, not merely platinum hair and innuendo, but a gifted actress whose artistry had been overshadowed by her image. The reel spinning endlessly became her vindication, proving that talent, once captured in light, cannot be erased by rumor. Her influence extended far beyond her own films. Future actresses, from Marilyn Monroe to Jane Mansfield, carried echoes of her in their performances. The archetype of the blonde bombshell, daring yet vulnerable, witty yet misunderstood, was born with Jean and lived on through those who followed. Yet none quite captured her particular blend of warmth and sparkle, her ability to be at once goddess and girl, myth and neighbor, untouchable and utterly human. Her legacy was not only in roles but in archetypes, not only in laughter but in the possibilities she opened for women on screen. Fans kept her memory alive with devotion. They formed clubs, collected photographs, cherished stories. They wrote letters decades after her death, as though she might still read them, as though the reel spinning endlessly could also carry words back to her. For them, Jean was not only a star of the 1930s, but a timeless presence, a reminder of resilience, humor, and the fragile beauty of a life lived too briefly. Her grave became a place of pilgrimage where flowers continued to be laid long after the first bouquets had wilted. The marble endured, but more enduring still was the affection of those who refused to let her fade. Her mother, too, preserved her memory fiercely, ensuring that the world remembered her daughter not as scandal but as brilliance. Mother Jean lived on for decades, speaking often of Jean, guarding her image, reminding those who listened that behind the platinum shimmer was a woman of kindness, intelligence, and sincerity. In this way, she extended her daughter's life beyond its years, weaving her memory into stories that resisted distortion. For a mother's voice, though shaped by grief, carries a truth that even the loudest rumor cannot silence. The reel spinning endlessly without end thus became both artifact and ritual. Each screening was a return, each flicker a resurrection. Audiences, whether in 1937 or in decades to come, found themselves drawn into her vitality, laughing as though she stood before them still, gasping as though her boldness remained shocking, admiring as though she might step from the screen into the aisle. This is the peculiar power of cinema, to cheat time, to preserve what flesh cannot, to let reels spin endlessly, even as life itself halts. Jean, more than many, embodied this paradox. Her body was lost, but her image remained forever young, forever radiant, forever present. And so we leave her here, not in marble, but in light. Not among wilting flowers, but among reels that spin without end. Her laughter echoes through theaters, her eyes gleam in silver tones, her wit sparks anew with each projection. Outside the projector, time moves forward, decades pass, generations come and go. But inside the projector, the reel does not end. It spins endlessly, preserving a star who lived too briefly, yet shines too long to ever fade. What, then, is immortality, if not the whirring of reels that carry a life into endless repetition, reminding the world again and again that Jean Harlow, though gone, still lives? A silver screen in an empty hall, glowing softly, is one of the loneliest and most beautiful sights. The projector hums. The reel flickers. Light spills across the wide surface, yet no one sits to watch. No one laughs or gasps or applauds. The images move, the story unfolds, but the silence of absence hangs heavy. In such a hall, Jean Harlow's face might appear luminous as ever, her platinum hair catching the light, her eyes sparkling with humor, her laughter frozen in perfect rhythm. And though no audience is present, the screen insists on remembering, insists on projecting, insists on preserving her beyond the years that her body knew. It is in this image of an empty hall that her story finds its resting place. For Jean's life was always both filled with crowds and shadowed by solitude. She lived before flashing bulbs, amid applause, surrounded by admirers, yet she so often returned to quiet rooms where silence pressed in, where perfume lingered though love was gone, where laughter echoed faintly after theaters emptied. The silver screen glowing softly without company is the truest metaphor for her legacy, radiance preserved in light, yet haunted by absence, eternal yet fragile, luminous yet solitary. Her story, when told, is one of contrasts. She was the goddess of the 1930s, the first sex symbol of Hollywood sound films, the platinum blonde whose image defined a decade. Yet she was also a young woman shaped by her mother's will, uncertain of her own desires, longing not only for fame but for tenderness. She embodied scandal on screen, yet in life she sought sincerity. She laughed louder than anyone, yet carried grief that laughter could not erase. She was adored by millions, yet struggled to find enduring love. She sparkled in theaters, yet faded in hospital rooms. She lived brightly, yet died young. The silver screen, glowing softly in emptiness, contains all these paradoxes, holding them in light that flickers but does not die. What remains, then, is not scandal or rumor, but reflection. Audiences still watch her films, still marvel at her timing, still laugh at her wit. Scholars write of her as the prototype of an archetype, as the mother of all bombshells to come. Fans still place flowers upon her grave, still write her name with affection, and each time her image appears upon a screen, she is reborn, not as tragedy, not as gossip, but as a presence, vibrant and alive. The silver screen offers her a kind of immortality, imperfect yet enduring, fragile yet luminous. In the quiet of reflection, one wonders what she herself would have thought of this legacy. Would she have been content to be remembered as the platinum blonde, the daring goddess of scandalous roles? Or would she have longed for audiences to see beyond the shimmer, to recognize the intelligence, the tenderness, the artistry too often overlooked? Perhaps she would have smiled, as she so often did, and laughed at the irony that she, who once drifted into Hollywood almost by accident, had become its most enduring symbol of sensuality and wit. Or perhaps she would have sighed, remembering the costs, the loneliness, the silence that followed applause. The truth, as with so much in her story, remains ambiguous, shimmering between possibilities, unresolved like the glow of a screen that never quite fades. The empty hall glows, the projector hums, the reel spins. Jean walks once more across the screen, her lines delivered with sparkle, her laughter ringing as though alive. No one sits to hear, yet her presence fills the space. The silver screen, indifferent to absence, continues to glow, offering her to the silence. And in that image lies the essence of her legacy. A woman gone too soon, yet present still, alive in memory, eternal in light. We end then, not with applause, not with scandal, not with sorrow alone, but with this soft image, a silver screen glowing in emptiness, holding upon it the figure of Jean Harlow, young, radiant, forever luminous. Outside, the hall is silent. The world moves on. The flowers upon her grave wilt. Yet within, the reel spins endlessly, and the screen remembers. And so do we.